this might be an opportunity to get some of the hostages out. But I think that Israel should also be turning to Egypt and to Qatar and informing them that Israel is now willing to find a way to reach a ceasefire, to end the war, and to bring all the hostages home in agreement with Hamas. Of course, Hamas has to declare that they will no longer govern Gaza.
I've been able to confirm through IDF sources that the DNA test was a match, that this is Yahya Sinwar who was killed here. Well, within the last few hours, the news breaking, actually an image circulating first online showing what appeared to be Yahya Sinwar, and the initial reaction was matching what appeared to be the same ear features, a similar mole to the right of the eye, and the same teeth on a man who was killed today inside the Gaza Strip. Pictures of Israeli soldiers around this body, mangled inside of the wreckage of the partially collapsed building around him, most of the body covered by rubble, but his head exposed. And immediately the face, the facial features look like Yahya Sinwar. We then start to hear that IDF ground forces who had engaged in this area at the time were telling their higher ups that they think that they had found the body, that they'd killed Sinwar. That set in motion the effort by the IDF to bring the body inside Israel for DNA testing. And within the last hour and a half, I've been able to confirm through IDF sources that the DNA test was a match, that this is Yahya Sinwar who was killed here. This appears that it was entirely incidental. We're hearing that the IDF soldier who was firing on the building at the time wasn't even in uniform on October 7th last year, that these are young 18, 19-year-old soldiers who had initially identified 3 men that they considered targets, combatants, and that they fired on the building that they were in. And it was only until they went inside the building and started to clear that they identified the bodies and realized that they might have just killed Sinwar. So this was, by all accounts, not an intentional effort by the IDF to target Sinwar. The last year, the Israelis have been telling us that Sinwar is in the deepest, darkest part of the Gazan tunnel network, that he's surrounded by hostages, and that they didn't believe he'd been emerging above ground the duration of this conflict, that he had entirely holed up inside this tunnel network. So it potentially calls into question some of that intelligence, whether he had been above ground at certain points throughout the last year, and that was not caught. But Sinwar as a man is, his story intertwines with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in remarkable ways. 61 years old, he was born in Han Yunis. His parents fled from what is now the Israeli town of Ashkelon during the Nakba, which is a displacement of tens of thousands of Palestinians from what is now Israeli territory into the Palestinian territories, into the Gaza Strip, into the West Bank, where he was born in Khan Yunis back in 1962. This is a man who has been arrested multiple times by the Israelis. At one point in the 1980s, he was arrested on 4 counts of life sentences for murder. He was accused of murdering not just Israelis, but Palestinians as well, that he believed were co-conspirators or collaborators with the Israelis. So he was killing Palestinians, and he was serving life sentences for killing those Palestinians when he was exchanged ultimately in 2011 for a lone Israeli soldier who had been captured. And the exchange, him and dozens of others were then taken or were then freed from Israeli jails and exchanged in this prisoner swap. But the Israelis at one point actually saved Sinwar's life. Back in 2004, he had a brain tumor while he was in prison. He was taken to Israeli hospitals. They removed the brain tumor and saved his life. So a remarkable story intertwines his life before he becomes the Hamas military commander, intertwines with all these moments here between the Israelis and the Palestinians for decades. Well, the questions now are whether or not we're going to see any sort of movement politically, militarily within Hamas that would show signs of an end to this conflict. By all accounts, Hamas is at this point, a year on, battered, just absolutely wrecked in some areas of their former capacity. They can't carry out these large-scale rocket attacks on Israel anymore like they could for years and years. And in those initial days of this war starting last October, Hamas was firing hundreds, thousands of rockets into Israeli territory. The last rocket attack we had was just one in the last 2 weeks. So the question going forward: where does this put Hamas as a organization that already lost Ismail Haniyeh, the political leader, the elected leader of the organization, when he was killed in a bombing in Tehran back in July? Sinwar elevated to a new role where he was more than just the military commander of Hamas. He was also the de facto elected leader of the political wing as well. The organization is, by all accounts, in tatters, but it's an organization that still holds about 100 hostages, right? It was believed that Sinwar was the man who was preventing any sort of hostage deal, continuing to rebuff the Qataris, the Americans, the Egyptians, saying that he won't give up these hostages at this stage of the war. So where does that stand, I think, is the big question here. The Hostage Families Forum has released a message within the last hour saying they welcome this news of Sinwar's elimination. Obviously, the man who's responsible for these hostages being taken into Gaza in the first place last October 7th. But they're calling now for this moment to be captured. The Hostage Families Forum is saying, let's use this moment to attempt to get a deal done, to retrieve the remaining hostages and end this war. But again, who is going to possibly be involved with Hamas's efforts to negotiate at this point to be able to get some of those hostages out? The time will certainly tell. I'm sure we are in a moment now where Israeli leadership sees this as an opportunity to end the Hamas conflict, which they were already seeing some off ramps in the last several weeks. They would not have launched this operation against Hezbollah. They would not be in southern Lebanon right now if they didn't feel confident that the situation inside Gaza was in their favor. The interesting elements here, as you'd mentioned, is that Israel, I know we talk about the big names of the Hassan Nasrallahs, the Mohammed Defs, the Yahya Sinwars, the Ismail Haniyehs who have been killed over the last 4 months. But the structure of these organizations, how they delegate leadership to field commanders and intelligence officers and different elements of this leadership tree, so many other names that haven't been major breaking news have been killed over the duration of this conflict. Names wanted terrorists by the United States, by Britain, by Israel. Men who have been on these terror watch lists for decades have been falling frequently on a weekly basis in Hezbollah and in Hamas over the last year. So these organizations right now, Israel has had an incredible amount of success slimming down the list of names of people who they wanted to kill for decades. But what does that do still to the structure of these organizations when we know that these are still massive groups with tens of thousands, especially Hezbollah, tens of thousands of men across Lebanon that proudly wear that flag and hold the patch and are willing to go fight in southern Lebanon? At this point, we don't have anything, and I should note that we don't have any recorded rocket attacks either from Hamas or from Hezbollah within the last 2 hours. I think that's an interesting element here. Just based on the history of the conflicts, between Israel, often there's been some major moments when political prisoners die, when even when main Palestinian leaders die of natural causes, there have been attacks or major rocket launches. We haven't seen that since this news was handed down. There's still, of course, the potential that as the sun sets here, that there will be attempted rocket attacks from Hezbollah, who's been firing daily, or an attempted rocket attack from Hamas, although their capabilities, their capacity to do so at this point appears to have been greatly diminished. We don't see anything out of Tehran just yet. That will be the big fish here that we'll certainly pay very close attention to. But this is in such a precarious state right now because the main concern is would there be some Israeli retaliatory strike on Iran? We're more than 2 weeks past Iran's massive ballistic missile launch, more than 180 ballistic missiles fired into Israel. Israel saying it would respond in the last 48 hours. The news that we've been following is that the Israeli response, according to U.S. officials, had already been determined, that they know what targets they're going to strike. Just last night, an Iranian spokesperson for Iran's Atomic Energy Agency said that they don't believe Israel's going to strike their nuclear targets, and that if they did strike these nuclear targets, that it wouldn't cause any damage, that Iran's nuclear program is ready for all eventualities. But we don't know at this point what's about to come next, other than we do believe that an Israeli response retaliatory strike on Iran is incoming. It's the holiday here. It's the Jewish holiday of Sukkot, which ends tomorrow night. So most people are not working. Most businesses are closed until tomorrow night, including a lot of elements of the Israeli government. However, we see an incredible amount of movement within the Israeli government right now behind the scenes, especially on the military side within the IDF. So we've been told that an Israeli response to Iran could come at any moment, but we've been told that for 2 weeks. So we're seeing some signs that show that a retaliatory response is expected. One of those major signs is that the U.S. has supplied a THAAD air defense system into Israel. We've just seen some images of that system here deployed. It involves dozens of American soldiers on the ground here in Israel to operate this America's most advanced ballistic missile, anti-ballistic missile and air defense system. And it was widely believed, and based on conversations I've had, that the U.S. would not be deploying a system like this unless they felt that whatever exchange of blows is about to come next between Israel and Iran could lead to the potential of that system being highly necessary.
For official confirmation that Yahya Sinwar is indeed dead. But there's our correspondent on the ground in Tel Aviv telling us that his sources are saying that, yes, Israel has got its man, and they're just considering now what this means for the future of the conflict in Gaza. And, of course, there will be an effect in Iran, too, on their thinking. What are your thoughts?
Yes, I think just on the likelihood that the intelligence, albeit open source intelligence, anyone can go and study it, looks increasingly likely to be the case. I often find that open source is, when used correctly, is right. And so I suspect it is indeed him. Secondly, look, this is a huge moment. This is the man who designed, arranged, organized the 7th of October attack on Israel that has led to this catastrophic outcome in the Middle East. And so I don't think anyone would be mourning his loss. He's a terrorist. Actually, the British Parliament has legislated that he's a terrorist, so he's not somebody who will be missed. I very much hope this can be the beginning of the end of this conflict, and certainly this stage of it, because there is no doubt at all that the pain and suffering that has been brought both on Israel on October the 7th and then this massive response and suffering in Gaza and beyond now is all because of this man. So I think this could be a turning point potentially.
So before I get your thoughts on those bigger questions, Grant, just for the unschooled in these matters, when you say that what you describe as open source intelligence leads you to the conclusion that, yes, this is Yahya Sinwar who has been killed by the IDF, what do you mean by that?
So there's a lot available, obviously, online, and open source OS intelligence or Intel has become an increasingly big part of seeing and working out what's going on around the world. When you talk about intelligence, British intelligence, there are different types of intelligence you can use. Humans, signal intelligence, intercepting communications. But increasingly, actually, open source intelligence has become a much bigger part of this. And certainly I know as Defense Secretary, in both the conflict in the Middle East post October 7th and in Europe in the case of Ukraine, that I would find that I could accurately rely on that information. Of course, you need to know where to look, which accounts to follow, and on which platforms. But I found them remarkably accurate a lot of the time.
Okay, so you are, it seems, pretty clearly persuaded. So let's act on the assumption that yes, this confirmation is on its way. We will see when that happens, but this is your view, and of course, certainly the view of our correspondent on the ground in Israel too. You say you hope that this will be the beginning of the end, and you're referring, I guess, first of all, to the conflict in Gaza. Our correspondent there was telling us that, yes, the head of heads of Hamas may now have been severed, but we're now looking at a headless beast with lots of different component parts, some of them holding hostages separately, which makes it very difficult to decide how to respond now when it comes to dealing with that. How do you imagine that should be dealt with?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the first thing to say, I mean, I always make this distinction very clear.
I'm going to interrupt you for a second, Grant, if you'll forgive me, but we now have that confirmation. The Israeli Foreign Minister is confirming Yahya Sinwar has been killed. So with that in mind, the question becomes even more active. Hamas is now a headless body holding still the hostages. How do you imagine Israel will deal with that?
Yes, well, that confirmation, as we were just saying, as expected. I think that it's really important that to make this definition. First of all, I am a great supporter of Israel as in terms of the democracy, not a great supporter of their government, and in the same way as I'm a great supporter of Britain, but not a great supporter of this government. And I think that one of the difficulties they've had is to find a route out of where they've got to in Gaza. We always said if you go in, you need to have a clear plan to leave again, and they didn't really have that. What this potentially provides Israel is a clear demarcation before, somewhere after, and now they can say they could leave with having achieved the removal of the man who planned and organized all of this. But as you rightly say, does that mean it's now even more dangerous, perhaps? Possibly, although actually in the course of getting this far, they had actually already removed and taken out quite a number of his deputies along the way.
Yeah.
So I suspect that this could be a very significant moment and could now change the course of what happens next. And it will certainly be a moment for that reflection in Israel and in their cabinet.
Okay, now, look, just get your thoughts now, Grant, if we can. Now that it is official, that expected confirmation that Yahya Sinwar has indeed been killed. Your thoughts on him, because he was quite a figurehead, wasn't he? The architect of the October 7th attack, a hawk within hawks, and this amounts to, well, in so many ways, a significant coup for the Israeli military and Israeli intelligence, and a moment of closure for those who've lost loved ones in Gaza to Hamas.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and that actually applies on both sides, because this man has single-handedly, through his decisions, his leadership, and he was quite a charismatic leader. He, for example, he spoke, I understand, fluently to Israelis, because not least because he was in prison, and he therefore had quite a hold over Gaza, and has done great damage, not just to the Israelis, but also to the Gazan people themselves as well. So, as I say, it's an incredibly significant moment. He's not the only, of course, very high-profile individual that Israel has removed in some very targeted attacks, both in Gaza and also, as you'll recall, in Lebanon as well, with Hezbollah. So, yeah, I think it is significant. But I think the most significant thing is it was very difficult for Israel to sort of ever move to the next stage without saying that Sinwar had been dealt with.
Yeah.
What's happened today moves things on for that reason alone.
We may have lost the line there to Grant Shapps. You're still there, Grant. I think we lost you just for a moment.
I can hear you.
Do please carry on.
No, so I say, look, I think what's happened today is very significant because it enables Israel to potentially move on by taking out the person who is most identified with what happened on the 7th of October. So I think you can't underestimate the significance of today. I think it will probably take a few days to sink in Tel Aviv. But this could be, I think, a very significant moment indeed.
Okay, a significant moment, possibly a moment to move on to another phase, another stage in this crisis in the Middle East. Grant Shapps, former Conservative Defence Minister, good to talk to you. Thank you. So, what about that next stage? Where may we be going from here? Good moment to get the thoughts of Brigadier General Yossi Kuperwasser, the former head of the Research Division in Israel Defence Force Military Intelligence. Hello to you, Brigadier.
Right. Good evening.
Can I just first of all ask for your reflections on what is now the confirmed news that Yahya Sinwar has been killed?
Well, of course, there's a reason to be optimistic about the future now that Sinwar is out. It's another milestone in our effort to change the situation in Gaza and to deliver the clear message that those who are responsible for the 7th of October massacre will pay the price for that. And it's also a milestone in our effort to weaken the Iranian-led axis of strangling Israel and bringing it to its demise. Now we have turned the table for a long time now, especially in the last months with everything that's happening in Lebanon. And this is another development in this direction that is very important because it gives hope to the people of Israel and to the people of the Middle East that they might look for and hope for a better future.
Right, so a demonstration of Israel's reach. I mean, no target is beyond reach. That's the message which Israel has sent and has sent really rather powerfully. I want to come to you in a moment just for more on your thoughts about what it means on the northern front, as it were, the fight with Hezbollah and Iran. But what do you think this news may mean for Israel's conflict with Hamas in Gaza itself? What might now change?
Well, I think what might change is the feeling of Hamas that without the leadership of Sinwar, they are herd without a shepherd. And that's something that may lead some people in Hamas to say, well, we need to change course. And Hamas, under Sinwar, was very stubborn in moving forward towards a deal. And maybe now there are better chances to move towards a deal that would release the hostages and release release Gaza from the rule of Hamas. That's very important. We are going to probably offer Hamas leaders, those who are left, safe passage out of Gaza, and provided that they release the hostages. And this would enable us to bring a new future for the people of Gaza and for ourselves in the context of Gaza. I hope this is going to be the way we are going to operate.
Right, so your hope is that the death of Sinwar may encourage those who are left behind in Hamas to look for an exit, as it were, maybe do some sort of deal, which you suggest could be on offer from Israel to leave Gaza and return the hostages. Is there an alternative scenario that we've been discussing this, that Hamas now being decapitated, its chief leader being killed, it now becomes a beast with no head, and the different components, parts of Hamas and associated jihadists in Gaza may pose an enhanced threat to the hostages?
That's also a possibility. We have to be prepared for that too. And that's why I think we have to intensify our military efforts in Gaza, to clarify that we shall be able to reach everybody and that dares to do something dangerous to our hostages. And that's something that we have to take into consideration as well. As I said, I hope that the optimistic future that I was describing will happen, but we have to be prepared for more dangerous situations as well.
So if you were in your old role, what sort of recommendation would you be making now to the IDF leadership and to their political masters?
I think the most important thing that we have to do now is to offer this offer that I mentioned before to Hamas. Leave and release the hostages, and we can give you in return some terrorist release from Israeli jails, just to save your face and leave the Gaza Strip. That's I think would have been my recommendation if I was in office, and at the same time to intensify the military operations and including preparing ourselves to the possibility that we shall have to be directly responsible for delivering the humanitarian aid to the Gazan populations that's suffering. And that, in my mind, is now trying to figure out if this is an opportune moment for them to change their suffering into some more optimistic future for themselves, now that Sinwar is leaving.
So for you, a moment to offer some sort of accommodation with what is left of the Hamas leadership in the hope of finally getting those who are left of the hostages released, and as part of that, getting more aid into Gaza. What about Iran? Does this go hand in hand with making that strike against Iran after the missile attack that we saw a couple of weeks ago. And how do you think the death of Sinwar would affect Iran's reaction to that? Because one of their instruments on the ground, Hamas, has now been very significantly weakened, well, further weakened.
Yeah, I think that Iran is losing all its assets in the region. We saw Sinwar killed. We saw Nasrallah killed. We saw the weakening of Hezbollah. We saw the weakening of Hamas. And we see the suffering of the Houthis in Yemen as well after the attack this last night by the Americans and everything that happened beforehand. So Iran is under a lot of pressure, and there's an opportunity here to really weaken the Iranian axis and to weaken the Iranian regime and to charge a heavy price for them for everything they've done so far. And I think in this respect, the expected retaliation of Israel to the Iranian attack of October 1st has to be materialized soon in order to clarify to the Iranians that it's time to rethink and to have some soul searching about everything they did until now, and hopefully encourage also some people in Iran to change the regime if they have the opportunity to do that. And this would make the Middle East a totally different place than the Middle East we are used to live in the last 40 years.
All right. So for you, again, a moment to act decisively against Iran, you believe. Let me, first of all, ask for your reaction to the news of the death of Yahya Sinwar, which is in itself a big moment.
I think it's difficult to exaggerate its importance. I think there are two profound consequences that flow from this. One is within Gaza itself. Hamas effectively is now disintegrating. There is no comparable person who could take over the leadership. And if Hamas survives in any form, it will be as a disparate number of very small Hamas activists or militants in various parts of Gaza, but without any central leadership that really matters. There's also small other terrorist organizations like Islamic Jihad. So there are still terrorists who are going to be active there, but of a profoundly different level of competence than the kind of leadership that Sinwar was able to give. That's the first consequence. The second is much more international. And that is what has now happened is the effective collapse of Iran's what they called their axis of resistance. For the years, Iran has not sought to send its own troops to fight against Israelis, except through missiles occasionally. But what it's relied on has been three allies. One is Hamas, second was Hezbollah, and the third were the Houthis in Yemen. Now, Hamas effectively is now destroyed as a militant military force. It will have individuals left, but without any significant ability to harm Israel as a whole. Hezbollah is profoundly weakened, both by the death of Nasrallah and by what is happening at the moment to its military capability. And the Houthis were never more than very serious nuisance value. They sent missiles from Yemen, but they were not a direct threat to Israel's security. So this leaves Iran with a huge problem, given that it is the prime enemy of Israel. It's been responsible for everything we've seen, ultimately, by creating or funding these terrorist organizations. And now they've been destroyed or are being destroyed. Iran has to decide, can it continue effectively? It will continue the rhetoric, but can it actually continue the policy of practical support for people who are no longer there to be supported?
Okay, so a number of significant and very, very interesting thoughts and observations from you there, Malcolm Rifkin. Let me just take one or two of those in turn. You make the point, you observe that Hamas now, with the confirmed death of Yahya Sinwar, is now effectively broken, shattered from the head down. They've lost their chief leader, which leaves them effectively in bits. How do you believe, judge, Israel should and will react to this in Gaza?
Right. Well, the first point I make is, of course, it's not just Sinwar's death by itself. Sinwar was the last of the leading members of Hamas to have survived. The others had already been dispatched and were no longer around. So it is the completion of a course. Now, you say, what is its impact in Gaza? I don't think Netanyahu has any sensible reason for continuing to have a war in Gaza, although he's won the war. The war has been won in all practical terms. The one unrealized objective is, of course, the release of the hostages. And he's now in a very important position to decide how he's going to achieve that, because he will never be forgiven by the Israelis if, despite all his strength, he does not get the remaining over 100 hostages released and able to return to Israel. Now, to do that, he has to make some sort of concessions, not that affect Israel's security, but that allow the remaining Hamas individuals, as your previous speaker was saying, from the retired general from Israeli intelligence was saying, I think he was absolutely right. There should be some sort of deal, which could involve allowing some of the minor members of Hamas to leave Gaza safely. So the Israeli objective should be twofold: primarily to get the hostages released, and secondly, just to get every Hamas member who continues to identify with Hamas out of Gaza.
We're following the developing breaking news after the death of Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas. We've heard in the last few moments from the Israeli leader, Benjamin Netanyahu, speaking there from Israel. Now let's get the thoughts of Zach Anders, our correspondent, who is in Tel Aviv, moved, I think, to the north of the city. Zach, welcome back.
Hey, John, I'm actually on the Gaza border now in the city of Sderot in the south.
All right, so you're on the Gaza border, and I think you're seeing some of the response of people there to the news of Sinwar's death.
Well, we see inside the city here in Sderot, which back on October 7th was one of the hardest hit major cities in Israel's south. Hamas terrorist gunmen were in the city for hours and killing people on the streets. When you talk to people that live here, they remember that day very vividly as being locked in to their homes. Today, they've all come out. They're waving the Israeli flag. Cars we've been hearing honking on the highway consistently. And this moment here for them feels like it's the start of the end of the war on the Israeli side. But behind me, as I look into the Gaza Strip in the last 30 minutes, I've still seen explosions in the northern half of the Gaza Strip as well.
Right. So that conflict's still going on, even while Israelis celebrate the death of Sinwar and hope for something better flowing from all of this. Zach, you were listening then to Benjamin Netanyahu. What did you make of his statement?
I think that we just heard him propose essentially an end to this conflict if Hamas was to accept it. The way I interpreted was lay down your arms, release the hostages, and you will be granted immunity, which I think is a remarkable element here and potentially a real off-ramp for this conflict if there are, and certainly there are, hundreds of Hamas men, faithful fighters who are still alive, who are still combating Israeli ground forces as we speak. If they choose to surrender, from what I make of that statement, that they will not be held and taken into Israeli prisons, that they will be allowed to stay in the Gaza Strip. I'm not entirely sure if that's the intent behind what we just heard, but from the Israeli side, that's the interpretation I'm getting from Israeli folks here, is that that is the proposal on the table now, but it is certainly dependent on collecting and releasing hostages who no doubt are fragmented all across the Gaza Strip, held by different factions, different groups of Hamas men throughout the Strip are still holding on to those hostages.
Right, interesting that's the interpretation of what we heard from Netanyahu. You're picking up from the Israelis that you're talking to there, Zach. And what we got from Netanyahu himself was in blunter, plainer terms. He said, give up the hostages, surrender, you will be saved. He didn't spell out what saved meant, so I guess we have to wait for some sort of clarification of that. But I guess we will see. Does it bear precisely the interpretation you were setting out there? How would that go down with the Israeli public, and in as far as Zach as one can generalize on that? If they were to be offered that kind of amnesty, how would that go down with Israelis?
And that's a good question, and I think that the main concern for the Israeli side is whether or not they can tolerate politically any sort of option. Well, I should just say that I think the majority of Israelis would accept any outcome that gets the hostages out, that there will be a complete acceptance of that scenario. But if this was to be an end to the conflict, well, I think now tonight Israelis feel as though they have defeated Hamas in the sense that the men behind, it's not just Yahya Sinwar who was killed today. Over the last few months, it's Mohammed Def, a commander who's been in Israel's crosshairs for decades. Of course, Ismail Haniyeh killed in that bombing in Tehran. So I think for Israelis, if there's a deal on the table that gets the hostages out, but doesn't mean that all of the remaining Hamas men are going to be brought into already overflowing Israeli prisons, I think that's accepted outright.
All right, Zach, always good to get your talk and your reporting there, live from near to the Gaza border. Zach Anders there. Joe Tanner is here with me. Anna Mikalova here with me. Guys, obviously a huge moment. Just to start from the beginning of this story today, the death of Yahya Sinwar, being described by Malcolm Rifkind as a moment that the significance of which cannot be exaggerated, Anna.
Indeed. One thing that stood up to me from your interview with Tim is how he said that in the speech, the upcoming speech, we're waiting to see whether or not Benjamin Netanyahu will be triumphalist, effectively, sort of suggesting that would be not that good a strategy. But I find that curious because the most obvious analogy to me is, of course, the killing of Osama bin Laden after the 9/11 attacks. I mean, of course, the American administration, the two administrations that followed that horrific terror attack, both had it as their mission, pretty much goal, to hunt and find Osama bin Laden. And you know, we know that George Bush asked for daily update on this because he made it the linchpin. This wasn't quite done at all in the same way by the Israeli government since the 7/7 attacks. However, it seems bizarre, you know, when bin Laden was killed, no one's saying, oh, don't be triumphalist. And it sort of seems a bit perverse that would be said now.
Yeah, I guess we can assume there will be a note of triumph there. I mean, for Israel, for those who have loved ones who are victims of the action of Hamas, those who have loved ones who are still hostages of Hamas, this is a huge moment for them. And you know, from so many Israeli perspectives, it is maybe a moment of something like closure. I don't know if perfect closure is going to be possible, but they will want to use this moment to make that point too. And then we look at the sliding doors which are opening up before us, don't we, Joe? We're exploring some of those today, and are going to play out maybe some of those scenarios before our eyes over the course of the next few hours.
Yeah, and the reality is, you know, cut off a weed, what grows in its place? You know, we have, to Tim's point, and I think more generally, it's always the element of, is it better the devil you know? And I mean, you know, it was definitely, in terms of the sort of feeling, the level of feeling, the mastermind of you know, October 7th, what's gone on, there are going to be many people that are very happy at this news, but there has to be a significant degree of fear because of where things have got to. Now, it could be, as Tim was suggesting, that this could be a breakthrough. This could be a significant moment where actually someone else comes into the room, the conversation takes place in a slightly different way. We know what it's like with negotiations where, you know, people get very entrenched in views. Someone else might come in with a slightly different position. However, to Tim's point, you know, if actually a more hardline leader comes in and it's the guy who's just died's brother, is it going to make that negotiation any easier? Like, you can sense that the tension just from families in the region is just going to be soaring right now, because it's, you know, what to some will be seen as good news is also then met with, but what on earth comes next? And that is, you know, for many people, for our frustrations as we watch what's been going on, there's a lot of people that have been putting work in to try and get to some sort of resolution. And, you know, I think Tim summed it up perfectly that, you know, it feels like there is the opportunity to go in two very significantly different directions now. And we just sit by and wait to see what that looks like.
So we watch and wait to see how this plays out after the dramatic news of the death of Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas. We wait to see what the leader of Israel has to say in his statement, which could be a very significant moment indeed, and maybe taking place in the space of the next couple of hours, for all we know. The death has been confirmed. Israel, Tel Aviv, has been in contact with Washington. The strategy from here on in will have been discussed between those leaders in Tel Aviv at a very, very intense pitch indeed. And I think we can get some thoughts on where we may be heading now. Certainly some informed speculation at the very, very least from our next guest here on the programme. Gershon Baskin is on the line, a former negotiator between Israel and Hamas. Welcome to you, Gershon, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. Good evening.
Good evening to you. Can I first of all please get your reflections on how you calculate the effect of the announced death of Yahya Sinwar? What does that mean for Hamas? Are they now, to all intents and purposes, now a wholly beaten force? Will that make them more likely to seek an accommodation, or does it in another way make them more dangerous? What's your view?
Yeah, we don't really know, and it's impossible to predict right now. There's no doubt that this is an enormous blow to Hamas. With Yahya Sinwar being killed, there is a vacuum right now, certainly within the Gaza Strip, but even amongst the political leaders of Hamas who are outside of Gaza, whether they be in Qatar and Istanbul.
Gershon, I do apologize. I apologize, Gershon. I need to interrupt you there because the line. We're very glad to have you with us on the program, but the line through to you is a little bit uncertain. We're going to try and make a clearer connection because we're keen to get your thoughts on where we may be going from here. Talking there to Gershon Baskin, who's a former negotiator between Israel and Hamas, for his take on what the killing of Yahya Sinwar might mean for the future of those conflicts, for the future of the hostages still being held in Gaza, for the conflicts with Iran and with Hezbollah, and the seems still impending counterstrike by Israel against Tehran. How will they make that calculation? Where will that lead? So many questions. We're going to try and talk through some of them for you here on the program, and I really am keen to hear what you make of all of this. What are your thoughts and reflections at this moment? Join in our conversation, please. Send me a text, 87222. Start with the word Times and tell me what you're thinking. Maybe a tweet to @Times Radio, or you can join in your own way, in your own voice, with a WhatsApp voice note to 0333 003 2353. Joe Tanner, Anna Michael over here with me in the studio. You do get a sense of being at a very, very significant, potentially a big significant turning point, Anna.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the crossroads. One thing I would say, though, is whatever is chosen, I think the problem with the Middle East being as complicated as to state the bleeding obvious as it is unless a real exit strategy is thought through, unless some sort of actual serious effort is made to some kind of long-term settlement resolution, then it is something that's just going to, even Hamas, will go away for a bit, and then in another form, the history tells us will pop up again, and so therefore it is a crucial moment and could determine the next.
Okay, now we have now, I think, then we established our connection with Gershon Baskin, the former Israel and Hamas negotiator. Gershon, so we now, I think, can hear you a little bit more clearly. Your reflections then, which were, I'm sorry, interrupted, but on what the death of Sinwar means for Hamas now.
Yeah, I think it's a big blow for Hamas, and I think it's impossible to predict what will develop in the coming days. I imagine it'll be difficult to talk to anyone in Hamas in the coming days. There'll be a 3-day mourning period when no one from Hamas will be speaking out. There isn't an obvious person who will take over Hamas in Gaza. There will be a competition for who will head the Politburo of Hamas between the different figures outside. But there is no significant leader within the Gaza Strip right now. Even I know Yahya Sinwar's brother, Mohammed Sinwar, was mentioned. Mohammed Sinwar is a military commander. He's not one of the political leaders of Hamas, and it's unlikely that he has the ability to take over the Hamas movement. So I think we will see a period of uncertainty and struggle within the Hamas movement before they determine the course of action that they will take now.
Okay, so look, when it comes then to Benjamin Netanyahu, who then he's got some very, very big decisions to take, and you say that the position in Hamas is very uncertain. It may take days at the very least to sort out. Can we expect to hear some sort of initiative when we hear from Benjamin Netanyahu very shortly, we imagine, maybe in the space of the next couple of hours? Will he show his hand at this stage?
Right, well, it's difficult to hear your question, but with regard to Israel right now and what Netanyahu should be doing, I think it's clear that the most urgent thing is to try and get the hostages released now. There might be an opportunity where discipline is broken down within Hamas, that Israel could make some public offers to people holding hostages, that if they release hostages, they will be given free passage out of Gaza, that they'll be given a bundle of money, that they can resettle someplace else. And this might be an opportunity to get some of the hostages out. But I think that Israel should also be turning to Egypt and to Qatar and informing them that Israel is now willing to find a way to reach a ceasefire to end the war and to bring all the hostages home in agreement with Hamas. Of course, Hamas has to declare that they will no longer govern Gaza. And I think without Yahya Sinwar there, that's easier for Hamas to accept.
Right. I mean, look, we can only speculate, but you are maybe in a better position to speculate than very many. Do you imagine that you would hear from Benjamin Netanyahu anything on those lines later on this evening? We're now told when we would expect to hear from Benjamin Netanyahu, but not for several hours yet. So, I mean, knowing Netanyahu as you do, would you expect him to take a bold step of the kind you're describing?
Well, this is the opportunity for Netanyahu to declare victory. This is the victory picture that he was waiting for. He was not going to end the war and leave the Gaza Strip with Yahya Sinwar still there and in charge of Gaza. So this is an opportunity. I would not expect Netanyahu to do this publicly, but we know that there's already been phone conversations between the Americans and the Israelis, and we can imagine that the Americans are on the phone with the Egyptians and the Qatari mediators. Again, every opportunity must be taken to save the hostages because their fate is unknown, and their fate could be exactly in the opposite direction. Hamas captives might decide that in revenge for the killing of Yahya Sinwar, that they will kill the Israeli hostages. And this is essential then for Netanyahu to act swiftly and to try and get a deal done that will bring them home.
So you heard that as we heard that. Mark, what did you make of what we heard from the Israeli leader?
Well, I think you're right. He was setting a triumphalist tone, and that's understandable. This is a great military coup for Israel and for Netanyahu personally, and obviously he's going to make the most of it. Yahya Sinwar was the architect of the 7 October terrorist attack on Israel. He is now dead, along with a lot of the other Hamas leadership. But he also sort of offered to the people of Gaza in the same way that he's offered to the people of Lebanon and indeed the people of Iran to sort of rise up against their leadership, and that will bring an end to the conflict. And until that happens, he is clearly going to continue, not least to try and rescue alive as many as the hostages that are still alive in Gaza.
Yes. I guess the subtext of that, Mark, as we say in a note of rather warlike triumphalism, but nonetheless clear surrender, give up the hostages, and if and when that happens, clearly Benjamin Netanyahu would present that as a moment of ultimate triumph, a win by him, a leader who's been under a great deal of pressure internally and externally.
Yes, I mean, there was an alternative approach that Netanyahu, in theory, could have taken. He could have used the death of Sinwar to claim victory, if you like, and to de-escalate and agree a ceasefire, which would get the return of the hostages that way. But it doesn't sound from his words just now that is the approach he has taken. He is going to maintain this hardline approach, maintain the military operations in Gaza, and hope that people turn against the Hamas leadership that's left, or they are so successful in wiping them all out that the hostages will get rescued. Wow. But it still leaves the question of what happens after that, of course, to the Palestinians that are living in Gaza.
In your view, Mark, I mean, look, Benjamin Netanyahu is very much criticised, but to reach out in the way that you described that as an alternative way of dealing with this, would that have been realistic? Because he doesn't know, presumably, none of us know, it seems, what will follow the death of Sinwar when it comes to the shape and the actions of Hamas on the ground. They've lost their leader. They are in bits across Gaza. Some of them hold hostages in different parts of that territory. Some of them may be in a mood for revenge, out of control of anyone, may execute some awful retribution on the hostages in their control. Netanyahu doesn't know, or can't know, can he, how that's going to play out. So a tone of emollients, would that have been the right tone at this point?
Well, it is an option. I wouldn't say it was emollients, but he could claim victory. He set out some military goals, a year ago, one of which was to destroy Hamas as a military threat to Israel and as an organization, a political organization in Gaza. He could claim that now they've killed the head of the snake, as it were, that has been achieved, and maybe bring back the Americans, the Qataris, and
Yes.
others to see whether there is some opportunity to get the hostages out.
Yes.
The danger of just continuing with the military operations is that the remaining hostages will be killed, and you then haven't really achieved all the aims that you wanted to do.
Yes. I suppose, I mean, isn't it the case? It is, I suppose, possible to do both of those things at the same time, while maintaining this tone, while maintaining operations, because the fighting in northern Gaza has been continuing today. Would it be possible to make a move towards the Qataris, towards the Egyptians, towards America, to try to get, maybe more discreetly behind the scenes, to explore the possibility of some sort of talks on some sort of deal while continuing with the conflict? Because that's what's been happening so far.
Yes, but at the moment there aren't really any negotiations going on in Gaza.
Or would seek to restore those. Or seeks to restore those while continuing as things are.
Yeah, that's certainly an option. And of course, we don't know who will take over the leadership of Hamas in Gaza. I mean, Mohammed Deif is probably the last one still probably standing. But, is he going to become the leader, or is it just going to be an interim period where a whole lot of individual militants continuing to fight?
Yeah.
And I think that's a big question. The other issue is the link, of course, to hit the fight against Hezbollah, because the advantage for Netanyahu is if there was some form of understanding, ceasefire, truce, call it what you like, in Gaza, that takes away the excuse for Hezbollah to continue to attack Israel, and you might make some progress there. The danger of the approach that Netanyahu appears to be set on, which is perhaps good for him domestically in political terms, is you cannot kill an ideology. You can kill a lot of people, and of course a lot of people have been killed in Gaza, but Hamas does hold an ideology. And will that ideology be rejected by the Palestinians? It's not clear that will be the case.
No, indeed, but it is good to get your reflections this evening. Thank you, Mark Lyle Grant, there, the former National Security Advisor, Permanent Representative to the United Nations.
Let's cross to Jerusalem now and speak to Alistair Bunkle, Middle East correspondent for Sky News. Good evening, Alistair.
Good evening.
Thanks so much for being with us. What do we know so far about the circumstances in which Yahya Sinwar was killed?
Well, I mean, precise details of the operation haven't been revealed, but we know that he was found and killed in southern Gaza in a district of Rafah called Tel al-Sultan. He was killed alongside two other people whose identities haven't been revealed yet by the Israeli military. He was killed above ground. The assumption often was that he would be found underground in the tunnels, perhaps using hostages as human shields, which he might well have been doing. But at the time of his death, and the pictures that have circulated of his body in a shelled building, he was above ground. He was wearing combat fatigues, and it is possible that he was fighting to the last, but he was killed by the Israeli military after they'd been hunting for their most wanted man for more than a year. Yesterday, they eventually got him.
Look, there've been reports that they sort of almost hadn't realised that they'd killed him, that they were, targeting senior Hamas leaders, but to actually capture the big prize, the main prize, was something of a surprise to them. Is there any foundation to those rumours?
I think so. I don't, from what I understand from speaking to senior IDF officials, that this wasn't an intelligence-led operation in so much they didn't have intelligence that he was at that location or nearby and then launched an operation. It was more chance that they came upon him. But I was in that very neighbourhood only last month, and there were still battles going on nearby, and they believed that there could be senior Hamas leadership either underneath it or close by. And as it transpires, at some point, Yahya Sinwar was there, and that is where they found him yesterday.
And what has been the reaction in Gaza and beyond?
I think it's really interesting to consider the reaction in Gaza. I think some people might assume that after the year that they've lived through, a lot of Gazans would be hostile and opposed to Hamas. That's not the true picture. I mean, some are, but a lot of them still see Hamas as the resistance against Israel. Sinwar was a popular figure. He was seen as the man who stood up to Israel over many years. And I think, let's go back to how he died and where he died. In 2021, after a short war, certainly short compared to what's going on at the moment, a short war between Israel and Hamas, Sinwar was pictured in an armchair in the rubble of a Gaza building. And that image became quite famous because it was seen as an image of victory and defiance by a lot of Palestinians. This time, he's been killed in combat fatigues, not hiding in a tunnel, but above ground. And I think, in some respects, it will have a similar effect. It will be seen as the picture, an image of their man, their leader, who died fighting.
So what does this mean for the people of Gaza, but also for the other members of Hamas? What is your feeling about how they will respond to this? We've been hearing from the US Vice President Kamala Harris. She says it's an opportunity to end the war, and there are signs that Israel, could be now seeking, as we heard from Eylon Levy there, could be now, seeking to reinforce the offer, which is that if Hamas operatives surrender and release all the hostages, that'll bring about an end to Israel's assault on that organisation. What do you think is going to happen?
I don't think that is going to happen. And actually, in the statements from Benjamin Netanyahu, but also Benny Gantz, an opposition leader here, but a former defence minister, former IDF chief of staff, former member of the war cabinet until earlier on this year, he also made the point that the war in Gaza will go on. I mean, he said for many years, and actually I probably think he's right. And that's for a number of reasons. I don't think ceasefire negotiations are going to be easy. You've got the question of who do they now deal with now that Sinwar is dead, because Sinwar was kind of the point man for those negotiations. And, there's huge concern as well amongst the Israeli public, but particularly friends and family of those 96 who are still being held hostage in, 96, 97 who are still being held hostage in Gaza, that there might be some revenge against those hostages now for the killing of Sinwar. So Israelis, understandably are celebrating the death of the man who oversaw their darkest day, but they're also concerned about what that might mean. And for ordinary Gazans, life hasn't changed. It is grim. It is dire. There is not enough aid getting in. We've seen that echoed by the US President, US Secretary of State, the British government, many others in recent days, that more aid needs to get into Gaza, needs to get in urgently. And if you look at if you're trying to imagine what the conditions need to be for this war to end, I don't think we are very close to them at all. There's the hostage situation, which I've spoken about, but I don't think Hamas will stop fighting. Hamas was more than one person, and I think they'll find it hard to find a leader who has any kind of sort of ability to coordinate it in perhaps the way that Sinwar did. But I imagine they will find another leader, and they'll continue fighting the Israelis.
Look, thank you so much for speaking to us. Appreciate all your wisdom. And, of course, bringing us right up to date with what we know so far. In Jerusalem, Alistair Bunkle, Middle East correspondent for Sky News. Great pleasure to speak, Alistair. Thank you. Well, here's the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, speaking in the last hour.
I'm standing here today to tell you that he has been killed. He who killed and caused the worst massacre ever since the Holocaust. He was killed by our soldiers, our heroic soldiers. And we have finished our accounts with him. But the mission ahead of us has not been completed.
Well, let's go to Eylon Levy now, former Israeli government spokesperson. Good evening, and thank you for joining us.
A very good evening.
Is your work done in Gaza now, the work of the Israeli Defense Forces, is that now complete?
There is certainly an opportunity now that the end of Sinwar will mean the end of the war that he started. Hamas has lost the war, but Hamas needs the world's help to understand that. What we need now is international pressure on Hamas's remaining leaders to lay down their arms, release the hostages, and allow for the peaceful reconstruction of Gaza in a way that it's not subjugated by a terrorist organization. But Israel has been clear this war can only end after all the hostages are released, and hopefully now they will release them. The Prime Minister is offering immunity, essentially, to anyone who is still holding hostages, saying if you leave with your hands above your head, lay down your arms, release the hostages, we will let you leave alive. But if you continue to hold on to the hostages, we're coming to get you.
So let's be really clear here about what the Israeli government is asking. It's offering immunity to the remaining Hamas members in Gaza if they give themselves up in exchange for the release of all the hostages.
Correct. Israel's mission since October 7th has been to remove Hamas from power, to dismantle its military, and to secure the return of all the hostages. So Israel is continuing to demand that all the hostages be released and that Hamas be removed from power. If they want to be removed from power in a gunfight like Yahya Sinwar, that is up to them. And if they want to surrender, that would obviously be the preferable option. But there is now an opportunity to finally bring to an end the war that Sinwar began and to turn a new leaf. And we're already seeing reports inside Gaza of celebrations among Gazan civilians who are telling, places like the New York Times, they hope Sinwar rots in hell now because of the war that he brought on them, and that can now end if they surrender.
What is the likelihood, do you think? Because we've been here before in terms of negotiating the release of hostages. And, certainly while Yahya Sinwar was alive and it's thought hiding in those tunnels, under the terrain in Gaza, potentially buffering himself with Israeli hostages. While he was alive, there was no chance that Hamas was going to surrender. What do you think the chances are now of the legacy of Sinwar being so poor that his former colleagues, will leave Gaza with their hands held high in surrender?
It's not clear who's in charge of Hamas now. It would appear that the heir apparent is Khalid Mashal, who lives in Qatar, which is, of course, a NATO ally. And so the world has an opportunity now to tell Qatar, you must extradite Mashal to us, get him to surrender, or there will be consequences. There are actions the world can take in order to help Hamas understand that its only option now is to surrender and release the hostages. But let's remember that we are dealing with a fanatical jihadist terror organization that is driven by an extreme religious ideology that has deliberately brought so much death and destruction to Gaza in advance of that jihadi ideology. And so, this isn't going to come to them naturally that they need to surrender. Their allies need to help them understand that this is over. Hamas is backed by Qatar, Iran, and Turkey. And those countries need to be pressured to tell Hamas, it's over. You've lost the war.
Do you also need the support of other nations who could be peace brokers in this as well? Will Israel be going to its allies, to those other countries that have been involved in these negotiations, Egypt, Turkey to some extent, but also the US as well? Will you be turning to them and asking them to double down their efforts?
Israel has already appealed to foreign leaders around the world from allied nations, saying there is an opportunity now to bring to an end the war that Hamas started. We need the war to end with all the hostages home. Obviously, we're not going to abandon them. But we also need the war to end with the Hamas terror regime removed from power. Because if we reach a ceasefire that simply leaves Hamas in power and Yahya Sinwar's successor in charge of Gaza, it only starts the clock ticking to the next war. It will be impossible to rebuild Gaza if the Hamas war machine is still there, determined to use the concrete that comes in for humanitarian purposes to build more tunnels. So there is an opportunity now. There is an opportunity now for the world to pressure Hamas to surrender, to release the hostages, and for the Palestinians to choose leaders who will repudiate the October 7th massacre, the October 7th war, and turn to a future of peace.
And will Israel want a part of governing in Gaza?
No, Israel's been very clear. We do not want to govern the Gaza Strip. Israel left Gaza in 2005. It never wanted to go.
How do you want to be involved, though? Because I understand, this is all obviously come through, perhaps some diplomatic channels, but I understand, I would understand completely Israel wanting some sort of say, wanting some sort of protection against another Hamas rising in Gaza.
Sure. Israel has no interest in being the civilian government in Gaza, but it does understand that it will need to retain overarching security control of the territory for the foreseeable future. Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005 and in exchange got Hamas, the rockets, and the October 7th massacre. It withdrew from Lebanon in 2000 and in exchange got Hezbollah, another Iranian proxy army, more rockets, and the threat of another invasion from the north. So Israel understands in order to have peace, you need not only to destroy Hamas, but to demilitarize Gaza. And the IDF is the only force that can be responsible for ensuring that Gaza is demilitarized, that Hamas is not able to smuggle in more weapons, more missiles to rebuild its army, so that we can have a chance of peaceful reconstruction and ultimately moving towards a diplomatic settlement.
But you can't get rid of the ideology, can you? And I wonder if the death of Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, will perhaps embolden other less senior leadership to make a play for the top spot. It will embolden them further.
I don't know whether anyone will want to take the leadership of Hamas because they know that the IDF will come after them. I think what would really have energized terrorism is if this war ended with Sinwar climbing onto the rubble in Gaza and declaring victory and saying, look, we managed to withstand Israel and get away with the October 7th massacre. That's what would have energized the idea of Hamas. But if Hamas's ideology is to declare a forever war against Israel, perpetrate it through barbaric violence, the death not only of Sinwar, but of the entire Hamas leadership, they're all dead now, shows them that that idea has no future. That idea will only bring the Palestinians misery and further conflict. And if they want to live lives of peace and prosperity, which is what I hope they want, they will need to embrace a different idea. But if they don't, that ideology can no longer be in power in Gaza, just like the ideology of ISIS is no longer in power in Iraq and Syria.
Eilon Levy, what is the plan if there is to be no peace deal, if there is to be no release of hostages and no surrender of Hamas? What is in the immediate plan then for the IDF in Gaza?
Well, let's zoom out and understand the bigger strategic picture. October 7th was the opening shot of a regional war in which Israel has found itself under attack on 7 fronts. That is exactly what Sinwar wanted. Every day we have attacks from Gaza, also from Lebanon, also from Yemen, from Iraq, from Iranian militias in Syria, Palestinian terrorists in the West Bank, and of course ballistic missile attacks from Iran. This is already a regional war in which we're fighting for our lives on 7 fronts. And what Israel will try to do is to keep up military pressure on Hamas to free the hostages, make sure it cannot rebuild the missiles that it has used to target Israel,
and so
continue the pressure against
I guess I'm going to press you, Eilon Levy, for the immediate plan in Gaza. I understand these 7 fronts. I understand the wider implications. But of course, with the leader of Hamas in Gaza now gone, dead, what is the immediate plan in Gaza? Because there is an awful lot of pressure on Israel to cease and desist to the point where humanitarian aid can flow freely, that they have razed to the ground too many buildings there, that enough is enough. What is the immediate plan of the IDF, do you imagine, in Gaza?
Yeah, Israel is under a lot of pressure to return to the reality that existed on October 6th, 2023, and Israel is resisting that pressure. It is going to try to exploit the confusion and chaos in the wake of the death of Sinwar to get whoever is holding the hostages, because it's not clear what their chain of command is, they're all dead, to free the hostages and surrender. It thinks there is an opportunity here for the captors of the terrorists, the captors of the hostages, to surrender, release the hostages, be sent into exile.
But if that doesn't happen, Eilon, sorry to press you, Eilon, if that doesn't happen, will the IDF, will Israel continue, as it has done over the last few weeks, with that intense desire, intense shelling, intense military action in Gaza to try and wipe out more of Hamas? Will they return to that agenda?
If, despite the death of the entire Hamas leadership, Hamas is determined to continue waging war against Israel, then Israel will continue fighting in that war until it removes Hamas from power so there can't be another October 7th and frees every single hostage.
The people in Gaza, how will they be feeling about the death of Yahya Sinwar?
I think a lot of people in Gaza would be hoping that this would lead to a ceasefire, that this would end the war. There's a lot of pain, a lot of suffering. People are just done with everything going on and hoping if this is it, that it will lead to an end to all hostilities, it'll end the war, it ends the bombing. I think that's the hope, but already that hope is evaporating as we heard Netanyahu today speaking about that the war is not over and that it's not even close to being over. So even though they might have had some hope, it's quickly going away. We already hear of bombings going on in Gaza. Reports are about 50 people being killed today in Gaza after Sinwar's killing. So not much optimism already.
Look, there have been mentions of discussions about a ceasefire, about how Hamas operatives should give themselves in, they should release the Israeli hostages, and that will bring about an end to hostilities in Gaza. Is that in any way realistic? How do you feel? It could be an indication, it could be a fear about what happens to that Hamas terror group now that their leader has been killed.
I think it's very unlikely that this is what's going on. That's to assume that killing Sinwar is really the way to destroy Hamas is overstating how Hamas operates. First, let's remember that there are leaders of Hamas still alive in Gaza and are involved, including actually Sinwar's brother, who is one of the senior leaders of Hamas. Second, you still have a lot of leaders of Hamas outside Gaza. You still have a lot of different cells and groups in Gaza of Hamas fighters who are not necessarily going to be affected by Sinwar's death and who still will carry on fighting Israel regardless. So this assumption is absolutely, it doesn't make much sense to me. I don't think, as we've talked about this before, I don't think that a military solution is a way to destroy Hamas, and there is no way to do it through a military solution. It's only through providing an alternative to Hamas that Hamas can be weakened.
And when you say providing an alternative to Hamas, what is that?
Well, if the idea, Hamas thrives on the idea that look at what Israel is doing to us, even what you just mentioned earlier, one of your correspondents, that Sinwar is going to be seen as a hero by some. He's died fighting. He wasn't hiding, as often the stories were saying. He wasn't surrounding himself by hostages to protect himself. And that's actually going to work for recruiting people, saying, see, our leaders don't hide, as Israel says. They are actually fighting and will provide for Hamas recruitment. The alternative to that is providing a political solution. Without a political solution, Hamas will continue to thrive and will continue to be able to recruit even more fighters today than it had last week and last year and 10 years ago. Without a political solution, there is no end of Hamas.
Right. Understood. And I think it's also important to remember that in, Gaza, Hamas is the ruling party. The government is run by Hamas. And as we've sort of been leaning into, the assumption that now Sinwar is dead and all of Gaza can sort of rise up and get rid of Hamas and we can find peace in there, that is naive, isn't there? Because just like Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas has followers in Gaza. As we were hearing from Alistair Bunkle, Hamas and Sinwar represent resistance against Israel. And the people in Gaza will argue that they've been put through so much by Israel that, of course, someone like Sinwar becomes heroic to them because he's seen as a resistance against Israel, who they'll argue has, taken their land, has trapped them inside the Gaza Strip, etc. So I think it's important to remember that as well, isn't it?
Yeah. You said it perfectly. I think the assumption that, everybody's going to ditch Hamas today and all the fighters of Hamas are going to leave and everyone's going to surrender and the hostages will be immediately released is being naive for people who think in this way. I think even the Israeli government obviously knows that that's not the way. Without having a deal, there will be no probably ceasefire anytime soon, and the hostages' lives also will be even potentially more a danger today than yesterday. The other thing is, right now we knew who Hamas leader is. One of the thoughts going around now is that Hamas will not announce who its next leader is, so they will not be on the assassination list. This is what Hezbollah has done. After Hassan Nasrallah was assassinated, we don't know today who's really in charge in Hezbollah. And we have not seen, just like with Hassan Nasrallah, we have not seen really Hezbollah being fully weakened, and that did not happen after Hassan Nasrallah's assassination, and I don't think we will see that in Gaza as well. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't an opportunity. I think there is an opportunity to do a deal as soon as possible, and that's what should happen. I'm not confident that the Israeli government is going to do that. I don't know if the new leader of Hamas is going to be inclined to that or not. It's a potential, but I wouldn't hold my breath on that.
Look, thank you for being with us. Really appreciate it, as is Abu Sarah, who is a Palestinian peace activist and journalist. Thank you. Let's speak to Simon Maybon now, who's a professor of international politics at Lancaster University, specialising in the Middle East region. Good evening to you, Simon.
Good evening.
Let's talk about who Yahya Sinwar was. And because we've not got a whole bunch of time, I had no idea, actually, that his release from prison was part of that famous Gilad Shalit prisoner swap back in 2011. Just take us to that, because it helps us to understand some of the history of the resistance of Hamas, how they came to be a terror group.
Yeah, so I guess there's a number of things going on. First of all, you've got someone here in Yahya Sinwar who had an existential hatred of Israel. Now, that was something that was cultivated over decades spent in Israeli prisons by virtue of his involvement in the quote-unquote resistance, his involvement with Hamas. And during that time in prison, he wrote things, he observed things, he learned Hebrew, for example. He articulated this real message of hate that ultimately culminated in the devastation, the horrors of October 7. So it's something that was honed for a long time, and it's that time that he spent in prison, that time that he spent talking with people, becoming a focal point in Israeli prisons, that gave him that credentials, I guess, within the hardline Hamas support group, within Hamas itself, and allowed him to rise through the ranks and to ultimately ascend to the position of leader.
And the origins of Hamas, how does he fit in with that?
Well, he joined pretty quickly after the group was formed in 1987. The group was formed during the first Intifada, the first uprising against Israel by the Palestinians in the late 1980s. And he was a prominent figure, a young man, of course, back then. But during that time, he began to take a very hard line against Israel. He was involved in a number of different activities that obviously landed him in Israeli prisons for 2 decades. So, yeah, he was someone that was very, very quickly identified by both the Israelis and I guess by some figures within Hamas as someone with the potential to be a very prominent player.
Yeah, he was behind the killing of 4 Palestinians. This is what Israeli interrogators found. Behind the killing of 4 Palestinians who'd been working as informants. In 1989, sentenced to 4 life sentences, with Israeli news reports saying that he'd convinced a Hamas member to expose his own brother as an informant before burying them alive.
He took a very hard line against anyone that was collaborating with Israel, or indeed perceived to be collaborating with Israel.
Yeah. There had been some thought that prior to October 7th last year, Sinwar was becoming sort of thinking of becoming a more moderate figure, moderating Hamas as a group. Is there any strength to those rumours?
It's not something that I buy personally, to be honest. I guess ultimately we'll never know without the
But then he must have been planning the October 7th attack for a period of time, so we can pretty much squash that, can't we?
I think so, yeah. It seems to have been a very deliberate strategy to lull Israel into a sense of security, a sense that Hamas had been sort of shifting away from a military strategy, a sense that Hamas had been defeated, almost, if you will. And that sense of security allowed the conditions that gave rise to October 7. So, yeah, I don't buy the sense that he was becoming a more moderate figure. Yeah. It doesn't tally.
What do we know about him in the October 7th attacks? He's been described as the person behind it. Do we assume, because it completely surprised Israel, do we assume that he was an intelligent operator, I suppose, in order to get that attack over the line, sadly, horribly, horrifically.
Yeah, so it looks like there's a couple of things at play here. One, that he was the real mastermind behind it. That's what the reports are suggesting. Very, very quickly, it was suggested that it was him who was behind it. And if you recall back just over a year ago now, there were very clear signals that Iran was not involved in October 7 itself. And now that discourse has shifted a great deal. But even from those very early days, it was Yahya Sinwar that was the one that was believed to be responsible. Now, the other thing is that in this masterminding process, he's obviously taken a very different line to that taken by Hassan Nasrallah and Hezbollah, in the sense that he seems to have gone sort of retreated back from technology. So we know that Hezbollah used walkie-talkies and we used pagers that were ultimately compromised. But what Yahya Sinwar seems to be doing is going analog, if you will, and just relying on person-to-person communication, sending messages.
Yeah,
exactly.
Handwritten notes, extraordinary.
Because this was the Svengali, this was the demonic architect as he's been presented, but they saw him as the chief resistance fighter. He was apparently also the key obstruction. He didn't want to do a deal. He didn't want to release the hostages. He wanted to fight on, and now he's gone. Let's discuss.
Yeah, this could be a very pivotal moment that could open the door to a ceasefire. But the question is, how much in disarray is the Hamas leadership and infrastructure? There's talk about his brother taking over, questions about whether this actually makes it easier or complicates actually getting to the end to the fighting and then the return of hostages. And I think given the fact that Israel does not clearly have a plan for the end state in Gaza and that it's in disarray right now, no order, it leaves me skeptical that it's going to be a turning point. Without that answer to the question of how does this end, coming from the Israeli standpoint and without the United States and others pressing them to do that, I fear you could see continued fighting and then others in the cadres of Hamas just stepping up because they're well armed, they've got tunnels, and they've got an ideology that says fight to the death.
Yeah, as one of our listeners has reminded us. But what about the two narratives emerging, Brian? Because on the one hand, Prime Minister Netanyahu saying this guy was running and hiding, we got him while he was trying to flee. But others are saying, hey, he was dressed in military fatigues. He was fighting. He wasn't hiding, surrounding himself by hostages or with hostages. He was out there leading the resistance. Which of those two narratives do you think is going to be more successful in the Strip itself?
It depends on the audience there, but in the Strip, I actually was just talking to a friend of mine who lives in Gaza. I worked with him more than 20 years ago, but we talk every few times a week, and he felt like the narrative that he's hearing on the street is that Sinwar is seen as a fighter and someone who is standing up for the Palestinian people. And this is
despite the fact that what he did on October the 7th last year has brought the most atrocious hell on the people of Gaza.
Yeah, this is just one guy's perspective. Yeah. I'm relating it. I'm not sure if it's the common perspective because there was, even before October 7th, if you want to look at a really interesting project, it's called Whispered in Gaza. People who gathered voices of people in Gaza who were discontent with Hamas before October 7th. So certainly that discontent had grown. I guess what my friend was essentially arguing was that this narrative that he was hiding in tunnels surrounded by old hostages was not the one in the end. And I don't think it's going to galvanize one way or the other attitudes in the Gaza Strip, which is your question, in part because people just want to see this end. They want to return to some sense of normalcy and stability. And that's why it's important, I think, for the United States, for European actors, and most importantly for the Israeli government to actually answer that question. How does this end? If this is a pivotal moment, we should utilize that. I'll remind folks that Osama bin Laden was killed in 2011, and it took the United States 10 more years to get out of Afghanistan, right? And unless you have a clear game plan of how this ends, then you can end up finding these wars go on for a long time.
Yeah. And what about Vice President Harris, almost trying to create an Obama moment, standing there and leading the US response to the death of Sinwar, saying justice has been served. And this moment gives us an opportunity to finally end the war in Gaza. What do you make of the US almost trying to own this, quotes, Israeli success in killing the so-called mastermind, the architect?
It won't matter that much if it doesn't produce outcomes that create the conditions for a ceasefire and a hostage release. Americans, just certain constituencies, Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, Jewish Americans, are focused on this, but those groups are about 2-3% of the electorate. Harris is 3 weeks before our elections here. She's clearly trying to claim credit. I don't think it's going to matter that much unless there's a much more significant outcome than the killing of this leader. And the significant outcome should be the things that she's talking about, but I'm not certain they're going to get there. And we're looking at, as Middle East watchers right now, another dynamic where Israel seems poised to conduct a massive strike on Iran, which creates all sorts of uncertainty. So here we are on a Thursday, late, heading into a Friday, and the storyline could shift pretty rapidly just in the next few days. So I'm not certain it'll matter that much, either for the facts on the ground, but also because of the politics here as well.
Yeah, you mentioned Iran a moment or two ago, Brian. You can imagine what their response will be. But what about others in the Middle East, like Jordan, like Qatar, like Saudi Arabia? How do you think they might respond to this? Might they put more pressure on those with the power to do something on the ground, including the Qataris who host the political office of Hamas?
Yeah, I think there'll be more talk about the end game amongst those actors too, and what to do with Hamas. And
I forgot to mention Egypt as well, of course. Egypt.
Yeah, Egypt's another clear actor. Look, all of these countries essentially for a year have been lobbying for a ceasefire, and they've all argued that with Sinwar and some of the leadership, if they're out of the scene, it might be easier to get there. Now's the moment to test that proposition. As I was saying before, I actually think it's much more complicated in some ways because you don't know who's the actual then decision maker on this, and what determines that is who actually controls the guns and who controls the money inside Hamas on the ground in Gaza. Not those political offices outside, but it's those who actually have the power and who are holding the hostages. And I don't think anyone really knows where that's at. But those Arab countries are key to actually getting to some sort of answer to that question of the end state, because they're the ones that are going to be expected to foot the bill, to offer some security support and things like this. But in this moment, we should use this moment to talk about how does this end, and answer that question.
I wonder, Nikki, now, I've heard several commentators talking over the last 12 hours or so saying that actually Israel should, quote, take the win, see this as an opportunity to, I hate the word off-ramp, but for use of a better one, find a way to get out of this cycle of violence, open up diplomacy with Hamas, with the focus, of course, being the return of hostages.
Well, I think that last point is the critical one, isn't it? Which is that has got to be the focus now of the Israeli efforts. And I think those of us who have supported Israel's right to take action, we might perhaps sometimes have had some question marks about quite how much pummeling the ordinary citizens of Gaza were taking. But I mean, I think that's had to be right, which is that Israel has had to focus on the. I think I heard earlier on your program somebody saying that there are still 97 hostages who are believed, obviously, to be being held, of whom sadly I think 33 are thought to have died, but whose bodies need to be repatriated. And I think whoever said that the last 12 hours is wishful thinking, because I don't think Israel is going to take the win or anything like that, or walk away until they have all those hostages accounted for. And I don't think any government could possibly do that. And I think that they'd be fortunate for this death to have happened, given he was the mastermind of the most horrific attack on October the 7th last year. But I also think this is a sort of a pivotal moment, if you like. I think, as Joe Biden has said, it's got to be a turning point. And I think that perhaps, if not peace, then perhaps some sort of more calm stability is a step closer. But until those hostages are returned, sadly, whether they are alive or dead, I think it's very difficult for the Israelis to draw any kind of line under the conflict.
Jack, where are you on this?
Well, I think, first of all, he was not just an an enemy of Israel. He was an enemy of human decency, responsible for the rapes and murders of innocent teenagers and other civilians at this time last year. He was also responsible for, and quite happy to see, the carnage on Palestinian lives, because that was all useful for his cause and for mobilizing people against the state of Israel. So nobody should be shedding any tears this morning, left, right, or centre. But I think what needs to happen now is clearly there needs to be discussions immediately towards releasing the hostages. There then needs to be a route map of some kind towards diplomatic discussions that would start to look much more seriously at a more permanent solution that involves 2 states. And then, critically, the democratic world, needs to return to the #1 focus that we should have right now, which is defeating the hostile Russian state in Ukraine. This has been a horrific 12 months in the Middle East. But what it has done is bought more time for Putin in Ukraine, because so much diplomatic, financial and security effort has had to be directed further south. So, let's get this done, get the pressure on, but then let's get into the winter and focus on making sure that the Ukrainians are free.
I just wonder, Nikki, as well. I mean, we've got these 2 wars going on. There's, a lot for America to focus on right now between those 2 wars, and also clearly the presidential election. And with that, the paralysis it brings, because, of course, November doesn't bring us a new president. January brings us a new president. So we've got a few months to go yet. We have heard criticisms, indeed voiced on this programme, that Benjamin Netanyahu is keeping the war going, will want to keep the war going to benefit him. He's facing corruption charges. It deflects from criticism at home, criticism not least from the hostage families that not enough is being done to bring those people home. And actually, that is a problem in itself. We spoke to Sir Liam Fox earlier on. He didn't buy that argument. Where are you on that, Nikki?
I think I'm perhaps more persuadable. I mean, I think there's no doubt. I'm not an expert in internal Israeli politics, but from what I see, Prime Minister Netanyahu is in deep political trouble, and I think there have been a lot of Israelis who, whilst outraged, horrified by last year's attack, have also questioned his actions and tone as Prime Minister. I'm sure he's got many supporters as well. But I think, I would agree. I think Jack made a really important point, which is that actually, if there can be more stability in the Middle East, then actually the focus has to switch back to Ukraine and what's happening. And I suspect, it's not just, if it is Prime Minister Netanyahu, it'll be President Putin as well, who is very much invested in ensuring that there is a Donald Trump victory in the US elections next month, and hoping that actually that happens, and that's advantageous to him in terms of his invasion of parts of Ukraine. And the trouble is, it's not those 2 sort of hotspots, but there are other parts of the world as well where there are significant difficulties. And so I think all leaders, all those who are breaking international rules, doing what they should be doing, will be hoping that actually they're going to get somebody in the White House who's not going to challenge them. And that's why this US election is just absolutely critical. And it appears to be approaching incredibly fast now. That the essential thing is to have a president in the White House who understands the international rules-based order and will stand up, as Jack says, for human decency and for international sovereignty.
And of course, Jack, whoever does end up in the White House, that is going to have implications for the Middle East. There does seem to be a sense at the moment that pressure being applied from the US is not necessarily being listened to in Israel. And some people would argue, well, that's fair enough. Israel's a sovereign state. It can do what it's like. I guess you've got the backdrop there of a lot of weapons are supplied, and the safety and security is very much protected of Israel by the US. So, what do you give much credence to this view that Netanyahu in some ways politically benefits from prolonging this war?
I'm sure he does. I hope that's not been his main consideration. I suspect certainly people around him will believe very strongly in the strategy of trying to destroy the different enemies of Israel on different parts of the border. I've no doubt, though, that there will be an element of the judgment here that is about prolonging his own position, but also about using the instability in the US that's almost certain to be in place, even if the vice president becomes the president. It's still going to be a fairly unstable American political environment until January, and that he will see some use in that. But I think there is an opportunity here, I think, to really maximise the pressure and to do that in a coordinated way, and with the clear objective, firstly, of getting the hostages home. Secondly, getting discussions underway about where the future might go in that region, linked to reconstruction of the damage in Gaza and so on. And then thirdly, get the focus of the democratic world back where it needs to be, and that is supporting the fight against the hostile Russian state.
Nicholas Hopton, the Director General of the Middle East Association, and formerly was the UK ambassador to Libya, to Iran, to Qatar, and indeed to Yemen. Nicholas, good morning to you.
Good morning, Callum.
Thank you very much for joining us. Can I start by considering what this means for the wider region? Does this send something of a signal from Israel that they wanted to eliminate the leadership of Hamas, and they have done so? What does that mean in the context of the Middle East?
I think it's undoubtedly a victory for Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Israeli government. So that will count in favour of Israeli objectives, although, as one of your correspondents previously said, the original war aims arguably have not been achieved. I think watching from Iran, which of course is an important player in what is going on in both Gaza and Lebanon and in Yemen, I think this does make the regime in Iran look weaker. Hamas is an ally, and the loss of Sinwar will hurt the Islamic Republic, and it makes the supreme leader in the IRGC look weaker. But arguably, at the same time, I think this will have less impact on Iranian calculations about what should happen next than, say, the killing of previous Hamas leader Haniyeh in Tehran itself earlier this year in July. And I think it's also worth saying that, if Iran were to react specifically to the killing of Sinwar, that actually might increase the risk of them looking even weaker, both domestically and in the region.
So Israel has had these military advances. Perhaps there's a weakening of Iran's leadership in all of this. But the issue here is that this can't purely be a military undertaking. There has to be something of a political ambition in here as well. How can Israel, in this moment, allow the emergence of a viable political figure or party or group or whatever in Gaza, in all of this, to allow the day after to become a reality?
Well, unfortunately, I'm not sure at this stage there's much evidence to suggest that the Israeli government is looking carefully enough at the day after scenario. As David Satterfield, former American ambassador and envoy to the region, outlined to you earlier on, what needs to happen in the long term for a sustainable long-term peace and security in the region for Israel and its neighbors is very clear, and it's enshrined in the UN resolutions and the international community opinion, which is progress towards a state, an independent sovereign state for the Palestinians. I'm not sure there's any signs at the moment that the Israeli government is planning in that way. So I think the next step requires essentially three actors to work for a ceasefire and for a de-escalation. Two of them seem to be focused on that. That is the United States. And we've heard what President Biden and Kamala Harris have had to say about the need now to take the opportunity for a ceasefire and negotiation, bringing the hostages home. The second one being Iran, and the Iranian foreign minister is busy with a regional tour trying to de-escalate the situation, obviously with an eye firmly on the objectives of the Islamic regime as well. The third actor, most important at this point, of course, is Prime Minister Netanyahu and his government, and there is a misalignment between, as far as one can see, where the Israeli government is pointing and where the US, Iranians, and the rest of the international community are arguing this should go.
Yeah. In your expertise, based on your experience as well, I wanted to ask about Qatar, which George Grill's just mentioned as perhaps the place to where Hamas looks now for its leadership. We know that Hamas and Qatar have close links, and we also know that Qatar has been instrumental in the kind of mediation efforts in the talks at various points over the course of the last year as well. Qatar's in an intriguing position here when Hamas looks there for leadership and guidance and indeed some level of hospitality or at least accommodation, but also has an important wider regional role to play. There's something of a contradiction in those two things, is there not?
I wouldn't necessarily say a contradiction, Callum. It's certainly a tension, and it's been there for a while. Also, of course, in the hospitality that Qatar affords to Taliban leadership in the past. So, which of course it does. This is often misunderstood. It does that at the request, essentially, of the United States. Now, in Qatar, there are two things going on at the moment. One is the Prime Minister of Qatar, Sheikh Mohammed, is very much a leading figure in trying to broker a ceasefire agreement in Gaza, working closely with the Americans, with the Egyptians, and with other international partners, including the United Kingdom. At the same time, you have some of the Hamas political leadership in exile there for a long time. And when one looks at who might succeed Yahya Sinwar at the head of Hamas at this point, there are two obvious candidates, both of whom are sitting in Qatar. Khalid Mashal, who used to lead Hamas until 2017, and then Khalil al-Hayya, who was Sinwar's deputy. Now, there are pros and cons in terms of achieving a ceasefire at this point, both. And I imagine both of those figures, one of whom is closer to the Iranians than the other. Mashal is not close to Iran, whereas al-Hayya is. All these factors will be in the balance as Hamas chooses its next leader.
Evil has suffered a heavy blow, but our task has not been completed. Those are the words of Benjamin Netanyahu as he vowed the war in Gaza will continue despite the killing of Yahya Sinwar, the Hamas leader who coordinated the October the 7th attacks. The Israeli Prime Minister says the fighting will continue until the remaining hostages held in Gaza are brought home.
This is an important moment in the war. We will continue with all our strength until the return home of all of your loved ones, who are our loved ones. This is our highest commitment. This is my highest commitment. I call on everyone who hold our hostages. Whoever lays down his weapon and return our hostages, we will allow him to go out and leave. And in the same way I say, whoever harm our hostages, blood on his head, we will reckon with him.
That's Benjamin Netanyahu, his words translated. As soon as the news of Sinwar's death was announced, people took to the streets of Tel Aviv. Many were celebrating, others were more cautious.
It's kind of a closure, but it's like it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't change a lot.
It's dangerous for our safety, like what Israel does and how it reacts to things that is coming for it. But also, we look at it in a more technical way, as if there's more to it. There's more like, okay, now we need to be careful of a counterattack, you know, like now we need to be afraid.
I'm going to summarize it and say we're not feeling like we're winning. Like, oh, the 7th of October never happened because we killed him. No, it's just like
it's not a
the
win.
7th of October did happen. Okay, we already lost.
I don't think it's a very good thing that people celebrate like death. Like I have no problem with him dying. I'm more happy than not. If like I prefer to people to celebrate way more when like hostages come back. But I can understand. You know, it's been tough for the Israeli people in many ways, and people just look for some kind of hope.
Well, the Sunday Times reporter Will Lloyd joins us this morning from Tel Aviv. Will, good morning.
Good morning, Callum. Hello.
I'm just intrigued by those people that you were speaking to in Tel Aviv last night who actually seem a lot more cautious about what this means than perhaps I was expecting.
Well, it's worth remembering that Israel carried out its first official assassination of a foreign enemy in 1956. It was an Egyptian colonel. So there is a deep history here of Israel taking out people who are enemies of the state, and then wars with those enemies continuing in a pretty bloody and destructive fashion for decades later. And I think all Israelis, or most Israelis, know that. I mean, one of the fascinating things about Tel Aviv last night was that as soon as this news came out, it was a bit like Israel had won the World Cup final in football. I mean, the streets started filling with cars and flags, and there was this sense of like clenched fists, pumping the air, relief and exhilaration. Definitely, that is definitely a big thing that happened here last night. But at the same time, as I said, Israel fights a lot of wars, and people are cautious about getting too excited about this. And again, there are 96 hostages, whether they're dead or alive, still in Gaza. And October the 7th still happened. That was still something that affected almost everybody here. And I think those two factors really play into the way people have reacted to all of the news this year. I mean, there's so much news here. There's a sort of unstoppable deluge of news in Israel. And one thing that really stands out when you speak to people, is some people anyway, is that there's a numbness now. People are quite numb to these developments because there's just so many of them.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I wonder how much of that is because of caution around how Prime Minister Netanyahu deals with these situations. Opinion polling suggests he is not popular, in a kind of across Israel, and certainly that the ambition here is to get the hostages home, which is something he was balancing, I think, in his messaging as well. But I just wonder if that is the underpinning issue here, is that nobody quite knows how to view Netanyahu.
Well, in a city like Tel Aviv, he's a combination of sort of Boris Johnson, Satan, Lucifer, and every other golem from history. But I would also be quite cautious, because I think a lot of the reporting from all English-speaking media organizations about Israel does tend to rely on people like me speaking to people who speak English, whereas there's a very large constituency in Israel, not really in Tel Aviv but elsewhere, of Hebrew-speaking people who don't speak English, Israelis, who think Netanyahu is a wonderful champion for the Jewish state, and he has had a bit of an uptick in popularity, particularly since June, as this war, the way we look at this war, has started to change, and we can start to perhaps say that on the battlefield, with unbelievable extortionate cost in human life, and the destruction of whole cities, which is actually a new thing in Israel's conflicts. I mean, the destruction of cities in Gaza is something very new that hasn't happened before. But even all that being said, Netanyahu is slightly more popular now. But Israel has always said that Sinwar was a block to any ceasefire and hostage release deal, and now he's not there. So this obstacle has been removed, and I think there will be some expectation now, particularly at the most sort of personal front of this, which is the hostage families, the people who still have their loved ones in Gaza. They will expect now something to move, and will that happen? We don't know.
Yeah, something to move, because there has been some element of gridlock, hasn't there, in talks. Hamas have kind of refused to engage beyond where things had got to kind of over the summer, really, and things have been in this holding pattern. Then we've got Iran factored into this as well, and whether Israel is planning strikes against Iran and retaliation, and it's just this kind of permanent state of what is going to happen next, and nobody can quite explain that, and not for the first time, Will.
Absolutely. And so I think we have to go back slightly and think about one of the most enduring and fascinating mysteries about Sinwar now that he's been killed, which is when he planned October the 7th alongside his colleagues in Hamas, what did they actually expect to happen? Did they think, were they pragmatic strategists who thought that if they kidnapped enough Israelis, Israel would be quite sort of human rightsy and make a big deal with them, and the Iranians would support Gaza and Hezbollah would support Gaza far more than both of those groups have? Or was Sinwar a fanatical religious fundamentalist? Where, remember, he was in the Hamas morality police in Palestine in the 1980s. Was he somebody who thought, if we attack Israel like this, we can start a conflagration that will ultimately destroy the state of Israel? Now, we don't really know yet what Sinwar was thinking. It's worth, if you can stomach it, trying to seek out the footage an Israeli drone took of his last moments. He is scurrying around in a very damaged building, and he throws a block of wood at the Israeli drone that's following him. And the Iranians have come out and said this shows, this is a martyr, this is a man, this is a guy who died with his chest out. But the thing that really struck me was not really watching what Sinwar did in his last moments, but look at where he was. I mean, he was in a wreck of a building. There were wrecks of buildings outside him. And he has contributed into turning Gaza into the most sort of absurd area of human suffering and destruction. And I think that is also worth, there's a lot of, we'll be talking about Biden and Bibi and deals and what happens in the American election. But look at that destruction and think about what's happened in Gaza in the last year. It was unthinkable, really, before this.